All right. Hi, everybody. Hello. Good morning. Welcome back to the National Press Club. Day 3 of Spring Lobby Weekend. Awesome. Yay. I know some of you are actually already lobbying today, so good luck to those of you who are doing that. And for those of you who are lobbying tomorrow, you have a little bit more time, but good luck to you as well, of course. We are now going to get started with our first session, which is a panel titled Can't Solve Migration with Militarization. So what we're going to do first is hear a bit of a framing. What exactly are we talking about from our, again, legislative manager for migration policy, Anika. And once she opens up the space for us, then we'll hear from our wonderful speakers. They can introduce themselves and we'll get started. So go ahead, Anika. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Larissa. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to, as Larissa said, Spring Lobby Weekend, Day 3. I know folks have been having a lot of powerful and compelling conversations and experiences. So I just thank you all for being here with us. And I know you're looking forward to your lobby visits. Just as a quick note, I want to highlight sort of where we come into this conversation from based on the conversations we've been having these last 2 days. We've noticed this common theme throughout this weekend that the US criminalizes migration, and for generations, our policymakers have intentionally crafted laws that exclude migrating communities from marginalized backgrounds. We've also heard that while the US has the resources and capacity to effectively manage migration, and to welcome individuals immigrating to the US for a variety of reasons, socioeconomic, political, life-sustaining, the list continues. The US has maintained a system that provides limited and in some cases no pathways for immigrant communities. We've also learned that in the midst of a self-made system that perpetuates inequity and inefficiency, the US relies on its overwhelming culture of militarism. The same militarism and unconscionable spending that we see in our defense and Pentagon areas, the same way we see it in policing and our criminal legal system, that same militarism plagues our immigration laws. And the US chooses to invest in a militarized enforcement machinery instead of investing in humane solutions to migration needs. Just last week, Congress passed a budget allocating more than $23 billion towards a cruel enforcement system. In fact, in that process, they increased the levels of spending that we saw for immigration and customs enforcement, AKA ICE, that existed under the Trump administration. As people with a moral calling to uplift human rights and to advance migration justice, we're constantly countering narratives that dehumanize migration experiences and conflate unrelated issues in the conversation about immigration reform. Today, we have the privilege from hearing from 2 speakers, Jennifer and Marisa, and I know they'll introduce themselves later, who work intimately in the sphere of migration and border policies. And they'll help us to further contextualize why militarization has no place in migration policies. And while we hear a lot of talking points about border crises and illegal migration, quote unquote, often arise as challenges to pathway to citizenship, why that rhetoric is misguided and harmful. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the stage.
Thank you, Anika. All right, well, I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves. Jenny, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. Honored to be here this morning to share this space with you. My name is Jenny Johnson. I am the policy advisor for the Southern Border Communities Coalition. Prior to, I'll just start off kind of my origins of some of my advocacy. I'm a graduate of Earlham College. I don't know if there are any Earlham College students here.
Yeah, there are.
I was a Peace and Global Studies major there, and that really got me started and was a formative experience for me, so shout out to PAGS. And I moved to the Southern Border region shortly after graduating and finding it fascinating. That was shortly after NAFTA was put into effect, and really saw the harmful implications of this economic policy on the border region in terms of who is migrating here and their stories. Here in the DC metro area, I moved back. I'm originally from the DC area, and I've worked doing organizing with farm workers and day laborers in Virginia. I also worked on issues pertaining to human rights in Mexico, doing advocacy in DC, and particularly the rights of migrants in transit through Mexico. And now with the Southern Border Communities Coalition, I am the only DC-based person for the organization doing policy advocacy, which is what I know a lot of you are going to be doing in your visits. Really excited for you to be doing that. So great that policymakers are hearing from so many people about these incredibly important issues. But Southern Border Communities Coalition, SBCC, we bring together around 60 organizations located in the U.S.-Mexico border region, the U.S. side of the border, human rights groups, humanitarian aid groups, civil rights groups, environmental organizations that all are looking at the impact of border militarization on border communities and those concerns, and then also speaking out against what we see as the intent to trade off and pit against one community against each other, whether it's militarization of border communities against people who are needing protection and status in this country, documentation status. So excited to speak with you all today.
Thank you. Marisa, want to go ahead?
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Marisa Limón Garza. I'm the Deputy Director with the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas, border with Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. I'm honored to be with y'all today. It's a real privilege to be in person and virtual in a hybrid reality and with you all, young people that are so energized and committed to the work of justice. Our organization, the Hope Border Institute, has been around for just about 7 years. So we're a small, nimble nonprofit that is growing and developing while we're also executing across a few different platforms. We are a Catholic organization, so a faith-based org, and we're focused on original borderlands-based research. Oftentimes folks here in DC, bless their hearts as we say in Texas, make policies and determinations for our borderland home. My community is a chosen place. I was born and raised in El Paso, went away to college at Notre Dame, and then
College shout out.
yay! And then, moved back to Texas, was in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas for 2 years, moved to Austin to be close to home but not quite home, and then ultimately moved back to El Paso just about 4 years ago to really continue the work of social justice. And so our original borderlands-based research is critical to our work. We also do that in conjunction with our policy and advocacy efforts. The formation of faith leaders is a critical component of our work, as well as also providing humanitarian aid and support to migrants in Ciudad Juarez and asylum seekers. And so we're part of many members, we're members of many coalitions and tables. It's rare that any of our work is done independently, but instead we believe in deep relationship and in partnership. One of our real focuses this year is both the wind back, God willing, of Title 42 and an end to MPP, the Remain in Mexico policy, as well as looking at the root causes of migration, the drivers of migration from Central America to the southern border, and addressing those complexities. So I'm thrilled to be with you all today. It's a real honor and privilege.
All right, thank you both. So we're going to start kind of broad, I guess. So as we just heard, you both work at organizations that have proximity to the border and the surrounding land, right? So what lessons have you learned about migration while doing this work? And what can you tell us about how migrating communities and US communities are impacted? And this is for both of you, so whoever wants to go first.
I'll go ahead and start. So many lessons on migration. It's a human right, and it's part of what we've done for millennia. Since the beginning of time, people, flora, fauna, have been on the move around the globe. And so it's just something that has been part of our existence and part of our human experience, I would say, since the beginning. And since the birth of nation states and sovereign nations, we've put different kinds of restrictions on that natural migration. And what becomes challenging and what I've learned, a very privileged to be born a US citizen. My father was born in Mexico but was naturalized, and the way that immigration policy at the southern border has changed in particular is so quick within a generation that some things that were very accessible for people, especially from Mexico, has become impossible today. And so it's fascinating to see, disturbing, as well as hopeful, how we have chosen We have made these realities, these policies that impact migration. They are choices that we make every day. They're choices that we make with our budgets. They're choices that we make with our policies. And so just as we choose to militarize and to enforce and all of these things, we can also choose another path. I've also learned that migration, there's a lot of fear packed onto it, fear of the other, fear of scarcity, a lack of resources, instead of approaching the reality from a space of abundance, of what we have plenty of, and there's more than enough to go around, and we can share, it becomes that. It's also about worthiness. Who is worthy to be part of the United States in this example? Who is valued? Who is a full human being? And so you can't look at migration and our US policies without looking at the impact of colonial history, of white supremacy, of structures of oppression that are baked into the United States fabric. And you can't look at it without also looking at carceral realities. You can't also look at it without thinking about all of these different nuances. And so that's some of the high points about migration. And then ultimately, I have the super honor and privilege of walking with many migrants and asylum seekers. And at the end of the day, I could just invite some of these colleagues here and they would just look like y'all. And there's not much of a difference because people are people. And so at the end of the day, they're moms, dads, sisters, brothers that just want to thrive and a chance to thrive. And I think that's what we all want. So there's a lot more in common than there is different.
Thank you. I would say one of the things that the border, particularly the US-Mexico border, has taught me, or what I've learned from that, is really the US-Mexico border I really see as a microcosm. So many of the things, so many of the trends, the dynamics that we see playing out on a much broader and global level, we can see under a microscope at the US-Mexico border. And one of those pieces is that nation-state borders are quite artificial, obviously artificially implemented. You know, just when we look at the US-Mexico border, that was created in 1848. And that, you know, when through a treaty with US and Mexico, large portions, multiple states were essentially ceded over to the United States from Mexico, and the people living on that land were offered the opportunity, you know, became US citizens. So, I mean, people always say in the border region, we didn't cross the border crossed us, and that is a reality. That is a reality for that. The other dynamic is the artificiality, is the ties. In many, like the city of Nogales in southern Arizona is called Ambos Nogales. You have Nogales, Sonora, and Nogales, Arizona. There really are one community, one city, one land, and people have ties across the border. And really what the land border does, there's that line in the sand essentially, is an impediment for relationships, for people visiting their families, for going to school, for going to different things. And so the artificiality, because people have ties and really they are in many ways one, you know, kind of the well-being of the community is just one community divided by this line, this very highly, you know, militarized line. Also, I think what we can learn looking at the border is, you know, kind of the division of global elites essentially, and deciding who gets to cross that line, who is worthy, as Marisa was sharing with us today. Also, we see, you know, who is arriving to our southern border right now and seeking protection, and who is allowed to enter and who is not. I think we've seen, you know, for many years there were cycles of more circular migration, and people would come based on economic needs of the United States and then leave. For many years, most of the people who were approaching and coming over the US-Mexico border was a lot of men who were engaged in certain forms of work and would return home to homes in Mexico. And then we saw escalating in the late 1900s, you know, that wasn't to the economic advantage or political advantage of elites in our country, and so really more of a crackdown on the border. And so obviously seeing families want to be together, and seeing more families arriving, more children arriving. If you talk to migrants, you hear stories of how climate change has led to a displacement of millions and people arriving. I think that's something very concerning that we're going to see more and more. how different economic practices in other countries, whether it's mining, have displaced people with global corporations, and just the stories of the spiraling violence and lack of economic opportunity that have resulted in people needing to seek protection at the US-Mexico border. And so I think that those are trends we see playing out globally when people seek stability, safety for themselves and for their family, and are doing what we have done for millennia, and it's seeking a place where we can achieve that for our families. So I think that those are things that both the border and speaking to people who are arriving and live at the border teach us.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning about climate change. We had a workshop yesterday. I don't know who here maybe attended that workshop. Okay, some people over there. That workshop was about what it means to be a climate refugee, even though it's not necessarily an official designation. And we've been talking about what reasons there are for people to enter the United States and, like you said, seek out more stability and better circumstances, and that's one of those, right? So getting a little more specific, we are, I said multiple times, lobbying, and I was just saying to you before we started that we hear, even when we're talking about a pathway to citizenship, concerns about the border in our lobby visits, right? I think people hear immigration, and there's so many things under that umbrella that border security in particular, right? Those words kind of come out. And it's interesting because we're hearing two different narratives. We hear we need more border security, the borders are not secure, but at the same time we're hearing there's a lot of militarization at the border. And so what is actually happening at the border? And can you talk to us about this both in terms of migration and enforcement?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think that one of the pieces when it comes to border, well, I'm trying to think of where exactly to start. That's such a broad question. With border militarization is that it is nothing new. And this concept of it is something that is, we have seen escalating militarization ever since the border was, put in place where it is currently now. But I would say, sorry, let me just gather my thoughts for 1 second here.
I can
go ahead.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Sure. So, me da coraje. This frustrates me so much. I can't even begin to explain. So I choose to live where I live. I have a lot of privilege to be able to live elsewhere, but there's beauty in my borderland home. It is just, if you drive around, it looks like any town USA. And then you get towards that line in the sand, which is steel fences, barbed wire, so many cameras, drones up above. I live in a militarized place. Mm-hmm. Like there's no other way to put it. And that's where so much of our investment has gone. And I would ask you, when you lobby with folks, is to really reframe and ask, what does security mean, and what does security look like, and security for whom? Because the reality is that the vast majority of the work that CBP and Customs is doing at our ports of entry is dealing with things, trafficking of drugs and things that shouldn't be happening, but they end up spending so much time related to migration issues because we haven't invested in that. We've invested in things that make us feel good when we are far away from the problem. So for some people, because of that fear of the other, and when I tell you the people that we work with, a mom with 2 toddlers, we're so afraid. We're not secure. We're not safe. What is mom and her 2 toddlers that are seeking asylum, fleeing from violence in Central America that the US in many ways has contributed to and established, but we're afraid and we're going to push you out. And so we choose to look at the borderland region in a binary of black and white when everything is gray and everything is complex. And so it's easy to fall into those narratives of like immigration reform good, but at the cost of border security. Like, no, again, we don't have to fall into that dynamic of scarcity. This is the most wealthy nation on the planet. Look at how much we invest into militarization. Like, it's alarming. Now many people in the American public have a better sense when we look at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and we see the level of infrastructure of the US military around the globe. So we have to take that hard look and not just take that narrative on and assume that as fact that the border is just wild and it's a free-for-all. Despite Governor Abbott, the governor of my home state, fueling that narrative. Besides Ted Cruz fueling that narrative. It's in their interest to fuel those narratives. But in ours, in the world of reality, in the world of a moral imperative and a humane response, we're not going to fall for that, and we're not going to take that as part and parcel. Because there have been examples of pathways that have been more humane and ways that welcome people in an orderly and safe manner. So we're not saying, as a lot of people say, oh, you're for open borders, where it's just a free-for-all. My community, people cross back and forth every day to go to work, to do different things, right? It's a binational community. And so we understand what it means to have an orderly process. We're not looking for chaos. And chaos is what everybody is so concerned about because we attach the political realities of the day to the southern border. And it takes people like you and like me to be able to say, no, we're not going to do that. And instead, we're going to humanize people. We're going to paint a picture of reality at the southern border. And we're going to welcome you to be part of a change for that. And that we don't have to just fall for these tired narratives that have no place anymore in this policy and in this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would say that is one of the most frustrating questions. I have to say, getting this question of, well, what about border security? And I think, as Marisa referenced, what is meant by that? What is security? Security for whom? And are we talking about community security? Like when I think about security, I think about being able that my children have enough to eat. The qualities of well-being for myself. And so, what do we mean by border security? And I think what we have seen time and time again with this rhetoric is this question of, let's have a trade-off. Okay, well, we will provide protection and status for a group of people, but we need to reach this particular point. We need to have X number of Border Patrol agents in the region. We need to have a certain number of miles of wall. We need to spend this number of billions of dollars on surveillance systems at the US-Mexico border. And the question is, very logically, when is it enough? If you look at from past immigration reform bills, which when we used to talk about comprehensive immigration reform, that was because there was this implicit trade-off. We'll have, quote, border security in exchange for protection for people. And if you look at what was in some of those past bills, those have already been reached and far exceeded. So it makes you wonder, what are we really trying to get at? If we have gone well beyond those quote unquote goalposts. How many agents do we need? And I know in different times it's said, well, border security means that only X number of people, percentage are, cross between ports of entry and are detained or not detained. 100%? Like, what would that even look like? What kind of cruelty and chaos would require actually nobody entering between ports of entry? And so I think really pushing back on, and why do we look at it as an either or? Why are we looking at it as like a limit? We need to have a separate conversation about protection. How do we keep families together, ensure that we are a nation that provides protection for folks needing protection, and not have it driven by this false notion of border security. I'm sure we're all very aware that when we say border militarization, we literally mean the military, the tools and trades and everything and the money and the companies that are involved in our kind of the military industrial complex have their eyes on our border. Billions are spent towards utilizing surveillance technologies that are used in other, arenas of war elsewhere in the world. And so looking at this and really, looking at the U.S.-Mexico border region and all borders as an area, a militarized zone in which we can deploy, whether it's more agents, military, like literally the U.S. military in the form of National Guard, walls. I mean, even after the time that we've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, globally, we've seen more and more and more walls go up, across the world. And, who is pushing that? Clearly, there are many corporate agendas, in the mix there that are trying to, and if you go to some of these huge border conventions, border quote unquote security conventions, you'll see all the technology, all the money that can be spent. We already have that CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which is the agency that of Department of Homeland Security that both has Border Patrol, which patrols between ports of entry, and then the Office of Field Operations at ports of entry, is our nation's largest law enforcement agency with tremendous funds at their disposal. And when combined with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, which does interior enforcement, their budgets have ballooned. So I think border security, it's a huge, I think it really gets to question how are we spending as a nation our resources, our money, and is it really making anyone safe?
Jenny, I'm going to ask you to repeat that last thing in case anyone wants to write this down. You said, we heard this yesterday too, actually.
Yeah.
So you said it is ICE, or at the border, is the largest police.
So CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, which we know was founded after 9/11. And as part of that, this new agency, they brought together agencies that were in other governmental departments before, which is informed Customs and Border Protection, which under that you have Border Patrol, which is between ports of entry, and then Office of Field Operations, which is at ports of entry, essentially. And they are the nation, and then there's also Air and Marine, that's a small subcomponent, but they are CBP, Customs and Border Protection, is our nation's largest law enforcement agency. So we also, I think, need to look at some of these issues regarding enforcement and border militarization, also thinking of it through the lens of communities that are being over-policed, through the policing landscape, and talking to, and people, when we talk about the border, there's obviously, like, you think about a map, and you think there's this line, but really the enforcement zone is much larger. For folks, I know there are folks here from New Mexico, from Texas, California, Arizona, maybe have experienced this. It's up to 100 miles into the interior. So if you live in Las Cruces, if you live, other communities, possibly to, Brownsville, to go to get your child specialized medical care, to go to the doctor, to go to visit family, you would have to go through an interior checkpoint. So we talk about border, that is not the way that kind of the government looks at it, is not the line. It is well into the interior of the country, and that's actually at the northern border as well. In terms of, we know that there are cases of, I think there was a case of 2 women in Montana who were speaking Spanish at a gas station or something, and they were profiled for that by Border Patrol agents at the northern border. So I know we're talking a lot about the southern border, but this militarization, the profiling, over-policing, it is definitely not limited to the southern border, and communities across the northern border experience this as well.
So the reason I asked you to repeat that is because it's just so striking to me. I mean, yesterday when I heard it, I think it was striking, but today hearing it a second time, it's really hitting me that when we hear that we need more border security, first of all, what do they mean by security? And then second, having that knowledge about CBP almost, to me, kind of counters the idea that we need more of that security, right? And so it's really interesting to hear you say that. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring it back to what we're lobbying on and kind of transition from this question, because I think it's one thing to look at what's actually happening at the border, right? They might say border security, how can we approach that conversation? How can we be in that conversation? But it goes one step further. After they've said that, it will be, and by they I mean any office who opposes that will say this. I've heard it from different offices. They will take that next step and say that undocumented immigrants need to wait. We need to wait for a pathway to citizenship until we figure out the border, is kind of even what I've heard. Oh, there's a border crisis, we need to figure that out, and then we can get to this, or something like that. So how do we detach those two things? I mean, we've talked a little bit about it over the weekend, but I want to hear from the two experts here who are focused on the border. How do you detach those two things?
I think, I think by storytelling, obviously telling stories of why I think people can tell their own stories or other stories about why immigration, we need immigration reform and protection for people, why that's so important. But why does it need to be attached? Like there's no actual, for the reason that
I'm asking
there's
you.
no reason. And another way is possible. We're not saying that things don't need to change at the southern border. Clearly what is happening right now and what is there right now is causing tremendous harm, death. That is not to say that we need to continue as things are. I think as Marisa says, there's another way that we can handle things. I think that one of the things, that we can see changes in how people are processed efficiently with rights and dignity respected. We do not need more Border Patrol agents. We need people, trauma specialists, child welfare workers, people that know how to deal with a traumatized population of folks arriving and those needs. Instead of having Border Patrol, let's say there are changes, people say, well, we need to have more agents because what if there are more people arriving to the southern border? Well, we don't need to put our resources in the Border Patrol to address that. How about something more like FEMA or other agencies, or providing resources to NGOs that have the specialty to provide that? So I think that it's not that we need to say that, okay, everything is totally fine at the border, let's just ignore it. I think we need to see some massive changes in what's going on at the southern border. But I think that these things should be, we need to de-link those. And I think that needs to happen in the form of legislation. We don't need to be having these trade-offs inherently in legislation. And so I think that it's a really tough concept to socialize and to impart and to convince, just because I think that this is how things have been for so long. But I think talking about there are other models for how we could be managing and approaching and respecting and lifting up the border region, and also considering immigration policy totally separate to that. I also think when you say border security, what are these offices? What do they mean? What are they trying to get at? What does that look like? What does a quote secure border look like to people? I think is a good question to ask.
I would also add, it's okay to call people on that and to ask that critical question, unpack that a little bit, because it's an easy pass. It's an easy out for having the tough conversation related to the realities. And so ultimately this is some insider baseball, but when the Biden-Harris administration was still the transition team and they were coming on, they would connect with us in the borderland communities and would say their fear was, you need to control the situation at the border so that we can move forward with immigration reform, other things. But it was this fear, granted we're in a global pandemic, we have immigration policies that have cut off all access to asylum, and so we are in a dire situation. But the message was very clear. It was like, in order for us to advance politically, you all need to kind of get your stuff together and make sure there's no chaos at the border. We can control that, right? But they were like, how many humanitarian beds are there available for people seeking asylum, that if we were able to lift some of these policies that you could actually welcome? Not to mention little to no resources to be able to do this. And so what happens is faith-based organizations, small groups come together and offer shelter and support. Tons of mutual aid, tons of volunteer work to welcome. And yet there's this idea of being on the defensive all the time when it comes to border security and when it comes to immigration reform. And my biggest frustration, there was a lot of hope and optimism from a lot of immigration advocates and partners when there was the advent of the Biden administration. And then the reality sunk in is they're still operating on the defensive. They don't have a visionary stance. And they haven't been able to articulate and had the political courage or the political will to be able to say, okay, and stand up against a system that has been baked in for so long that only focuses on militarization and deterrence, and instead create a different narrative and a visionary approach, leaning into the moral authority of the moment and saying, this is a different path that we can create, and this is a different route that can work, and we can have both of these at the same time. For them, I mean, in their political calculation, dealing with the border has become, for a lot of folks, kryptonite. Like, nobody wants to deal with it. And maybe in their political calculations, it doesn't make sense for them to deal with it. But for the people and for our collective consciousness and our realities, like, we don't have another alternative. And so it's imperative that we decouple those things and that we help people understand the nuance of that and help them have the language for that vision, that there are humane pathways to be able to do this work. There are examples of what the wind down to the Remain in Mexico program looked like. That was a very successful model in our local sense of how you can start to receive people in a safe, dignified, and orderly way in the midst of a global pandemic. And so there are realities, and we can do this together. And then it also needs to be just stated, like, these policies are ultimately racist. And this is funding the police, just in a different context. And so people want to hide behind the border, all these things. Like, no, it is what it is. And so you're either, are you on the side of this, or are you not? And what's the kind of world that we're trying to create? If the southern border is the microcosm, as Jenny says, then what is this microcosm telling us about who we are as a country and what we stand for?
Yeah, and also, I mean, so many of these, one thing I'm always so overwhelmed, I think, pointing out, I think, and calling on and calling out that both our U.S. immigration policy and policy towards the border are grounded in racism, xenophobia, and white supremacy. I think when we look at the U.S.-Mexico border and the policing of the U.S.-Mexico border, I think, you know, I think we all look at the prior administration and the attention paid to the border and in that was no question the construction of the border wall, and that was, there's so many destructive elements. But this dates back to, if we look back to the late 1800s, which is really when we saw some of the first policing of the border. And that was not, I think, as folks might think, that, you know, obviously the focus on, you know, people arriving from Mexico, but that was focused on Chinese. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act, essentially, that there were many workers who were lured, brought over to work from China to work on the railroads in the Western United States. And then when it wasn't advantageous for political elites, there was decided that, nope, we're gonna close that down. And so the first policing of the US-Mexico border occurred to try to exclude people from East Asia to come over. So the Border Patrol, and then later on, there was more groups that were working, and there was a reliance on for labor and for workers coming from Mexico, and then pushback economic forces said, nope, we don't want that anymore. The Border Patrol was founded in 1924, and it's really interesting very disturbing to look at the origins, kind of the racist, xenophobic, white supremacist origins of that force. So, and then we've seen, you know, changes in how we approach the border at different time points. If we look at the mid-1990s, and that was a post-NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Mexican economy was put into a tailspin by these economic forces, and that ties around the same time that we saw this new model and approach toward the border called prevention through deterrence. It was not new, but essentially it was a model explicitly grounded in trying to seal off, whether it's through wall or more agents, in urban areas, which is areas where people would traditionally cross. That's, you know, you have your jobs, you have resources, maybe that's where you're living, et cetera. Trying to center more enforcement in those urban areas, pushing people, saying it's going to be so remote, or the trip will be so dangerous, people are not going to cross. And it was known, these policies were put in place knowing that people would lose their lives, whether it's to exposure, et cetera. So that was in the 1994, around that time period, the early 1990s, this prevention through deterrence model that's when you really see a sharp increase in the budget of the agencies that are carrying out this border militarization. And then we can say again, we saw around 9/11 even more of an expansion, I would say, of border externalization. And that means so we have our land borders at, a southern border, but really seeing more and more of how the U.S., whether it's Plan Sur, the Merida Initiative, military assistance, whether it's to Mexico, to Central America, and elsewhere, in training and capacity building for those countries to build up and fortify their borders. So I know folks really say, the U.S. would say, yes, we have our border, but saying we're going to try to stop people at the Mexico's southern border, and really having, through training, CBP has offices throughout Central America as well as in Mexico, and doing training to try to externalize our borders. So I think the U.S., we have physically the U.S. southern border, but really the United States has tried to externalize and push our borders further south. And you can really see kind of the number of apprehensions that the Mexican government, the Mexican immigration system has had, and deportation of Central Americans has skyrocketed. And that really, I think, is in large part to political pressure and resources provided by the U.S. government.
So I'm hearing you say that, yes, there's the physical border, but the enforcement kind of has not only extended upward, but also south. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, in terms of, and there might not be a U.S. Border Patrol agent standing outside of Tapachula in southern Mexico, but the political pressure, whether it's adding particular resources or training or other kinds of dynamics, and applying pressure on Mexico to try to fortify their border, to try to apprehend more people as they are transiting through Mexico up to the United States, has really escalated over the past 20 years. So we can look at kind of the externalization of our borders, and it's also linked to in the Caribbean, also in terms of with the Coast Guard. It's not just the CBP.
So taking a step back, I feel like we've talked the border kind of related to policy, what decisions is the government making, but we are talking as well about the human-centered approach to our advocacy, and I want to talk about what human-centered approach there might be at the border. And so I'll start with you, Marisa, specifically. What roles do communities play in border reception practices?
In El Paso, it's an incredible network of shelters coordinated by Annunciation House, a local shelter leader in the region. And so everything is done, I would say almost over 95% by a volunteer army of people who are committed to welcoming people on the move. People that are entering the United States or being released from ICE custody usually are only in our region for about 72 hours before they move on to other parts of the country with sponsors or with family members. And so for that time, the people will offer, obviously, I'm going into my bilingual brain because I go into techo and all these different things. So like basically housing, a safe place to sleep, a change of clothes, warm meal, a shower, which for most people they haven't had if they've been in the custody of these agencies, might be in the last 5 days, they haven't had a chance to bathe, and then coordinating their outbound travel or other kinds of support that they may need. Some of our local legal service providers also provide trainings on how to know their rights and what to expect when they go to continue on with their case, because people are not, it would be remiss, a lot of these people are seeking asylum, which is a legal process, internationally recognized. And so there are very specific guidelines and guidance for that. And so they will continue that process until their case has a final determination. And so they will go on. And so in the spirit of mutual aid, just like we've seen throughout the pandemic, just like you've seen in Ukraine right now, of people supporting one another, using resources neighbor to neighbor, it's a very similar approach at the southern border. Some communities do receive federal funding through a special allocation through FEMA. Others choose to just use private funds and donations from individuals, so it varies. There is no real infrastructure, unfortunately, because we've so invested in the militarized response. That's where our money goes. Even if there's been a humanitarian angle or some kind of assistance, it's been coupled with, it's also going to include militarization. And so we've seen the advent of certain new programs and new contracts that were given to organizations that specifically did this work of reception, but also had ICE on site and had other kinds of partnerships with DHS. And so it's important to recognize that local communities would like to separate that out and not to have that militarized presence, because we're welcoming people that have already gone through incredible amounts of trauma in their countries of origin and then through their countries of transit and then ultimately in custody. And so it's important to be able to welcome them. I briefly mentioned the Remain in Mexico program, or the Migrant Protection Protocols. That was initially ended by the Biden administration. There was a wind down, and then we're now in the second version of that because of some court rulings. And so through that wind down process, we were able to work with people and welcome them on a scheduled manner, just like anybody else traveling through the United States, anybody else traveling from abroad, to be able to make coordinated efforts. And the incredible amount of human dignity in that process was wonderful and welcoming. And so we're part of the Frontera Welcome Coalition, an organization of over 100 groups locally in El Paso that have raised their hand to say we want to help welcome people on the move. And so we would be at the port of entry every day, having 2 or 3 people to literally welcome people, receive them, help orient them. We were able to secure with county funds and doing lobbying very locally on how to get resources to provide transportation from the port of entry to the shelter and from the shelter to the airport or to the bus station. And so all of that was coordinated with local dollars, local resources, and we were able to make that happen through our own lobbying efforts. And so that's a way that shows how a community can respond and can care. And we know there are many communities around the country that are receiving people once they kind of get sent off from the southern border, and they're doing similar kind of whole care, whole person approach related to that. And oftentimes they're faith communities who are wanting to step forward and say, okay, we're going to walk with this family, walk with this person as they go through this process, and help them access healthcare, help them access education, help them access any kind of resource they may need in order to be safe, secure, and have a positive experience while they're waiting and going through their legal proceedings. And so it requires us to step outside of ourselves. It requires us to be mindful of welcoming the stranger, so to speak. And it requires us to think about the resources that we have, the privileges that we have, and how to extend them and offer them, while building systems that support people so that no one is burning out trying to address these needs, but that we create a network of care that supports people in these difficult times.
And just to be clear, I'm not sure if you defined it. Can you say very quickly what is the Remain in Mexico policy?
Sure. So when we're talking about the externalization of the military, we're also talking about the externalization of the right to seek asylum. So you would be able to come to the United States and step foot, and you're supposed to be able to say, I would like to seek asylum from my country of origin in the United States. And the last administration established a program where people were forced to remain in Mexico, that you would not be allowed. You used to be able to do this from within the United States, housed with a sponsor or with a family member who could help you have care and well-being and be free from danger, free from harm. And instead, in coordination with the government of Mexico, they agreed to a situation where Mexico would provide a safe place for these people, which couldn't be further from the truth. There was no real plan and no coordinated effort to receive people. And so what happened is there was one migrant shelter specifically in Ciudad Juarez called the Casa del Migrante that was receiving deported Mexicans, repatriated Mexicans that would usually only stay about 72 hours before they moved on. And overnight, there was the need for what are now over 20 shelters that have sprung up to respond to the need of so many people on the move. So from 1 to over 20, with very little infrastructure and support. We're talking about a church, a modest church. Ciudad Juarez is not, it's known for maybe its extreme wealth and extreme poverty, but there's not a lot of affluence in these spaces. And so people would take the sanctuary, roll out some cots, and thinking this is just going to be a short-term thing. Well, this spanned years. This was over 2 years of this program happening, where people they didn't have very many protections. While they were able to secure some supports in Mexico, they would have to go to the state government and go through all these bureaucratic processes and be targeted as migrants and being treated poorly, whether it was accessing healthcare, which was always a battle, whether it was even trying to get a work permit, which was incredibly difficult, whether it was having childcare. There was no childcare for children if a parent was to go to work, let alone accessing education. And then beyond that, organized crime in Mexico, really targeted migrants, thinking they have resources that we can exploit. And so there were kidnappings, assaults, attacks, actually deaths. And so we heaped on additional trauma to people already incredibly vulnerable, already harmed in their countries of origin by this reality. And many people, if they didn't show up for their court date, were deported in absentia, and that came with a 10-year bar, meaning for the next 10 years they couldn't try to access protection. And this forced people either to go back to their country of origin under the threat of death, or to try to enter the United States illegally or undetected in very remote regions, which was incredibly dangerous, and or try to stay in Mexico and find some kind of protection. And so by having the migrant protection protocols remain in Mexico, we exposed people knowingly, willingly, intentionally to grave violence, grave danger, and psychological torture, because ultimately the little agency that people had was stripped away from them. Because the program was new and there wasn't a lot of foresight into how judges would adjudicate claims and how the whole process would go, it was all being figured out on the fly. And these are people's lives and well-being. It was very difficult for them to be able to live in this limbo, and it still is to this day. We were just with 150 men in Ciudad Juarez who are part of this new version of the program, and they are at their wits' end, just trying to figure out how they're going to advance in the situation. And so it's the consequences that we see, that we think are remote and don't impact people, really do. And that's Remain in Mexico.
Thank you. That paints a really clear image of what is the reality of migration at the border. And we're going to go to the audience for questions in just a moment. I do want to give Anika a chance to contribute to what we're saying, maybe respond to the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Anika, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just extend a huge thank you to Jenny and Marisa for not only reiterating a lot of the points we've heard throughout this weekend surrounding around anti-immigrant policies and xenophobia, but also unpacking what the realities of migration really are in some ways, and what we see as very hollow oppositions at times towards pathways to citizenship and to creating a more humane infrastructure. And I won't be long. I do want to allow the audience time to ask questions, but sort of I want to uplift what I heard today and what I think we've been talking a lot this week, in the sense that there are very clear ways to address the problems that we see and the migration needs before us. It's a matter of intention from our policymakers, and it's a matter of will. And so when we talk about pathways to citizenship, or when we talk about border reception, the reality is that the answers are there, and that the resources are there, and that the capacity and intelligence is there. And so that's part of where your power is this weekend in Spring Lobby Weekend. We talked a lot about, like, there's power in being able to understand what we see happening and to be able to call that as it is and to name it. And so I just want to reaffirm the role that you all play right now, and thank you for being a part of that. And then I'll let you all continue with the Q&A session.
Thank you, Anika. All right. Are there any questions from the audience? I saw someone, yeah, right here in the front. Thanks, Rosalie.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I was just curious, you said like how most people, they don't spend more than 72 hours in the shelter. I was wondering how the pandemic has affected that. Like if someone were to go into a shelter and test positive for COVID, like what would happen to them? Like would they be able to stay in quarantine, or would they just kind of be sent out?
Great question. So there's been so much of a separate apparatus that's been set up. So we're fortunate that, again, with that lobbying specifically of our county and our city government, there is support that the Office of Emergency Management, our local kind of response to the pandemic. They've had hotels that were set up so that people could quarantine. So in partnership with Annunciation House and this hotel, we were able to make sure that people were able, before a vaccine, be able to go there, and before even rapid testing was really available. So we've been having that resource. There's also a huge core of medical volunteers who support the shelters and also help provide testing. And so now through that cohort of people, and then the Office of Emergency Management does on-site testing at the shelter. And so that's another way that we've been able to provide. And now that there's rapid testing, many volunteers have been trained on how to administer them. And so that's another resource that's available. And so while the hotel is available for quarantine, there wasn't a ton of care being offered to people. And so there was also a group of volunteers established and developed to respond to the needs, to do daily welfare checks as people would do their quarantine, and check in on their needs, if they needed a change of clothes, if they needed any specific accommodations for their food. And so that was just another volunteer effort. But it was and one of our early advocacy efforts was really to push for there to be a testing apparatus, with not necessarily by the enforcement agencies, we don't want them necessarily testing people, but that there should be a government supported role to do this, and it shouldn't just be on local communities to take that on. But that was not met well. So ultimately we've developed our own response to how to be able to do that. Now many migrants and asylum seekers are vaccinated in their countries of origin and or while they're in Ciudad Juarez. Not all of those meet the WHO. They're not on the list of the WHO recommended list of vaccines, which is another probably whole political analysis, but they are vaccinated, and they also have the chance to be vaccinated once they're in the shelter. You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, let's go. There's a green shirt. Yeah.
So hi, good morning. My name is Sophia, and I come from Florida International University. And first of all, thank you for your perspectives, for your information, for your service to our community, right? That needs to be noted, so thank you. My question for you is, both of you have mentioned that there are various methods of how to change, the process of coming into this country. And I'm just curious, what do you know? How can it be, do you think some of the things that you have seen can be implemented here? So I just want to, I don't know, you both touched about that. You both mentioned, there's various ways. So I'm like, what ways are there? So yeah, that's my question.
Just from a very basic standpoint, I think that there need to be, at the very least, safe channels for people to arrive. If people are arriving to our southern border or to any border, to arrive and to be promptly processed at ports of entry, and so that, as opposed to making conditions so difficult, as Marisa referenced, that people were waiting for months, if not over a year, for their immigration court date or something of that nature, so that people can be promptly processed. And then once they arrive, we don't need to rely on carceral options, that people can be released into the community, into the interior. This is just a very, of course, we all have much grander visions, I think, of what immigration policy would just, and what our immigration policy and border processing would look like, but just something very immediately and concretely that is absolutely doable and policymakers should not shy away from, is that we do not need to rely on detention. People need to be promptly processed when they arrive at the border. For quite some time, people, if they approach the border, there was a process of metering, and people were made to wait for days, weeks, months, more, to be able to present themselves at ports of entry. So people need to be promptly processed. We need to have services available so that people who are arriving with trauma can be received by and processed not by law enforcement officials who don't have any expertise in this area, but by trauma-informed people who are child welfare professionals or other folks of that nature. So I think that prompt processing and then not a reliance on detention and then people can be released to communities throughout the country. Perhaps they have family or to elsewhere where they can receive resources and not in a carceral setting.
I would just add that something that is now more part of our common understanding is this idea of a humanitarian corridor. When we talk about Ukraine, there have been certain areas that have been designated should be safe and protected for people to receive assistance and care. And we've advocated that there should be humanitarian corridors at the southern border as well, so that people can seek those protections, and maybe they're staffed and operated a little differently than some of the other regular ports of entry, that you think differently about the way that you welcome people and that you use the enforcement apparatus that you have in a different mechanism and have different supports. As Jenny was mentioning, people that have trauma-informed care, people that are social workers, medical professionals, people really thinking about early childhood needs of young children, like ways to really meet people where they are and receive them and process them in a dignified way that reflects that reality versus one that's just a militarized response of someone in a uniform coming to enforce a policy. So many of these people come from countries of origin where it's been the military or police that have caused a lot of the harm on them. And so even just encountering them and interacting with them is a trigger for a lot of people. And so having a different face of welcome and a way of receiving people should be one that's addressed as well. And that's something that we could shift.
Thank you. Let's take one more from the ballroom, and then we'll see if there's any questions from our Zoom audience. Back there in a black mask. Yes, you.
Hi, my name is Ahmed. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, by way of Palestine. Thank you guys very much. My question, well, in Europe, they're very explicit, in Western Europe, they're very explicit about why they're apprehensive about accepting African and Middle Eastern migrants. It's an identity issue, and it's spoken amongst the politicians and amongst the general public specifically as a racist identity issue. Here, it feels like it's done under the guise of border security, national security, as you guys have discussed. So it feels like almost as we're discussing lobbying tomorrow or maybe today, we're being trained how to respond to border security, when in reality, we know that's not their real concern. It's a racist issue, it's a xenophobia issue, as you guys mentioned. So how specifically do we articulate ourselves and address their real concerns when we're lobbying or advocating for migrant communities? Thank you.
Okay, a popular question. I think a lot of people have that question.
It's really challenging, and thank you for pushing me to think critically about that. I think I'm sure you all have discussed these different kinds of strategies. I have a lot of colleagues who are strong advocates and strong lobbyists, but ultimately are will push no matter what against and kind of, for lack of a better, read people and be like, you're awful because look at how racist you are, look at how all these things, this is the worst. And then so while that feels good, right, to speak truth to power in some ways, I think we have to do our own internal thinking and okay, how can we have a real dialogue that will help us get somewhere productive? So I think while we may have our read on why someone is approaching the issue the way they are, we have to help them unpack the realities. You're from San Antonio. I know that San Antonio has received a ton of migrants and asylum seekers, specifically from South Texas and other parts of the state. And so the storytelling piece that Jenny was talking about is critical. If there are first-person accounts that you have that you can share that reach someone's heart and head, that will go a lot further to help get to the reality of the issue. That it is a human issue, that it is focused on real people, and there's real impact. And here, we also want to invite people into a solution that we can co-create together. So you're asking them to partner with you and to continue to do this work to develop an alternative. We may not have all the answers, but I'm confident that together we can figure out how to do this differently. And we're asking you to be part of that journey with us. And so instead of, again, you're awful, you suck, like look at all these awful things that you do and you stand for, and I know why you do it. It's like, okay, yes, all that is true. And in front of you, here's how I can share this human story with you. We can relate on a human to human level, and I can invite you into a process of dialogue so we can begin to work towards something that's more beneficial for all of us, is one option.
I completely couldn't say it better. I've been there in meetings, and you just want to like roll your eyes or be like, what? You know, when you're talking to some folks. But I think that storytelling, that's where I think the value of storytelling and advocacy visits, because that paints such a clear picture of if any, you know, folks in the group are able to do kind of, as you say, first person storytelling, in just connecting with that person, that part of humanity that hopefully we all share, I think can be incredibly powerful. As well as I know that just personally going into, there's so many things that are wrong that are happening. And I think it's important to identify and flag, but I do think going in and saying another way is possible, and here is a vision, and this is something, and then challenging people on like, this is possible. We are a country with tremendous resources, with, you know, a history and a legacy that we can draw on, not a consistent legacy, but elements of our history that have where we have been the best, and we can be that and we should be that. And I think flagging not just on what's wrong and what's bad, but what we can be and what we need to be, and that human kind of grounding and that commonality that we all have, I think, in wanting a better world, a better country, a better community.
Thank you both, and thank you for that question. So I'll go now to Sarah with our at-home audience. Are there any questions, Sarah?
Thanks, Larissa. We don't have any questions yet from the virtual audience. We've got about 15 or 20 folks here, and I know you can't see all of us, but everyone's listening and engaging in the chat. There was one comment in the chat that I'll just share, which is someone mentioned a book called Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security by Todd Miller. And we've just been kind of typing a little bit in the chat about everything folks are hearing. So I'll hand it back to you for more audience questions, but thanks for checking in with our virtual audience.
Thank you.
That's a great book. I highly recommend. There's so many, Todd Miller is a writer based in Tucson, Arizona, has done some really great work looking at climate change and migration, and looking at the southern border, as well as kind of the border military kind of technology industrial complex. So highly recommend his books for folks who are looking to explore more.
Awesome. Well, there you go. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I think we can take one more question then from the ballroom before we go. Everyone's pointing to their friends to be called on. There's more than one of you being pointed at right now. This is very difficult.
Good lobbyists.
Oh my goodness. All right, let's go over here. I'm sorry,
wow.
It was, you both had large groups of people pointing at the question asker.
Hi, my name is Monse from California. I think a way to change the narrative regarding Border Patrol is not to be scared of the question, but to embrace the question. So our main concern is safety, right? How is our safety? But why don't we ask politicians, what about the immigrant safety? It's no secret that ever since we had refugees, the claims for sexual abuse and just violence have increased within our immigrant human community. We also seem to forget that we have cases like the Sergio Hernandez case that was taken to the Supreme Court in 2019. It was the case before DACA. And you have a 15-year-old in the Mexican side being shot in the face by Border Patrol, no accountability, release off charges. So it's like flipping the narrative. You want us to be safe, but are they safe as well? Where is the human right in that? And is there an active movement to secure the safety of truly everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's such an amazing point. I think when people talk about border security, again, what does that mean? And you also brought up something I know, thank you for bringing up. I mean, we know our organization, our coalition, has been keeping track of the hundreds, over 200 people who we know have died at the hands and encounters with Customs and Border Protection officials since 2010. Roughly a month ago, Carmelos Cruz Marcos was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents outside Douglas, Arizona, and there's no accountability for these deaths, for these people who are killed by agents. And so there's just both the brutality and the dehumanization of individuals who are crossing, and then the absolute impunity and how that is really led to this even out of control agency particularly with the Border Patrol. And so I know that's something that a lot of our partners, we work with groups in the southern border space and many organizations, but also groups looking at contextualizing this within the larger calls for policing reform and just how law enforcement is impacting communities, the over-policing. That's something. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because just these, again, the largest law enforcement agency in our country and the absolute impunity by which abuses and deaths are handled.
Thank you for that question. Well, I think we are right about at time. I do want to ask Anika to come back and give us some closing thoughts on our session, and then I'll make some announcements before we head out to lunch. So go ahead, Anika.
I think sort of just where I leave this conversation is when we're talking about militarization at the border, when we're talking about enforcement, detention, our carceral practices, and when we think about what fears or what traditions lead people to want to promote those type of harmful situations, I often find that I like to get us to a place in a commonality where we realize that in some ways, though it may not look like it, we want the same things. We want safety, we want humanity, we want security, we want orderliness. So let's figure out how we unpack where the real differences are and how we get to the middle. It's a challenging conversation to have, but it's not an impossible one, and it's not one that doesn't mean that we can have progress in the end.
Thank you, Anika. And let's say thank you to our speakers. Thank you both so much. So I will let the two of you head off the stage. I think Jim, it looks like, will help you off with your microphones. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. All right, so like I said, please stay seated. I do have some announcements. And I'm going to ask in just a moment my colleague Justin Hurdle to join me, because he also has some announcements related to lobbying for most of you, which is happening tomorrow. So the first announcement that I want to make is that there is one more opportunity to talk to our migration policy team and get more questions answered. That is at 6 p.m. today. They are virtual office hours only. That link is also on the website, fcnl.org/SLW. Click on the schedule. You'll see a link to the office hours. Only virtual at 6 o'clock today, and it will be your last opportunity to ask questions directly to the migration policy team. Another thing I'll say is that we are not here tomorrow. Do not come to this building tomorrow. We will not be here. And so tomorrow we'll actually be at the Lutheran Church. That address and location is in your program. You can also find it on our website. I would look at your program first, since you all have one right in front of you. It is right next to Capitol Hill, like the Senate House buildings, the big Capitol Hill building, it's right across from that. So just a couple blocks away, we are at a really great location. For those of you who have in-person visits, it is a very short, I'll say 7-minute walk, depending on how quickly you go, to the buildings. And for those of you who are going to be doing your visits virtual, we will have laptops and spaces set up for you so that you don't need to worry about showing up with your own devices or figuring out where to take the virtual visit. We have all of that set up for you, and some of you will actually be taking those calls from our FCNL office, which is also only a couple blocks from the Lutheran Church. So you do have to report to the Lutheran Church first. Please do not go straight to your lobby visit. Why is that the case? There are still COVID protocols in place within congressional offices, and they will not let you in unless you are escorted in by a staffer. So we want to give all of those instructions at the church. And the reporting time for that, if you want breakfast, which I hope most of you do, is at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And we will have an opening session with a special speaker at 8:30, and we will also give some of those instructions that I just said. So I'm going to ask Justin to come up here now and give you some final logistics on your lobby visits, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Justin. I'm going to move over here.
Thank you, Larissa. You made my job a lot easier. Hi, everybody. You've probably received emails, text messages, phone calls, in-person questions. For me, if you haven't met me yet, my name's Justin. I've been helping to coordinate all the lobby visits. We're super excited. We have over 100 meetings scheduled. I have scheduled 2 more meetings even today. So this thing is happening. The offices are excited to meet with you, whether it's in person or virtual. Back in January, when we started this process, we did not think we would have any in-person meetings. As of right now, we have more than 40, which is really, really exciting. Those offices, those congressional buildings that some of you will be walking through, have not had a lot of people walking through them. And I know, for my time on the Hill, that's one of the most exciting things, is being in those hallways, going into those offices, and really speaking truth to power, especially on such an important issue like this. So, because I'm a logistics person, that's why Larissa brought me up. I just want to give you a couple updates. My friend Alex here, we have created a very easy page on the website for you to easily access your lobby visit schedule. Yesterday, during your lobby training, you may have received a paper copy version of that. Same exact thing. You can go to fcnl.org/SLW visits. It'll bring you to a Google document. Hopefully you know what state you're with. Just select your state and it'll give you your state schedule. You should only be attending your Senate meetings and your House meeting. If you do not see one scheduled, please feel free to come over to the lobby questions table and we can discuss it, or I can give you an update. But to what Larissa said about those in-person meetings, when you're looking at your schedule, there's information about what office it is, what time it's at, and then there's something called format and location. That's what I really want you to focus on. If it says Hill office in person, that means you are going to those Hill offices. As Larissa said, you have to make sure that you arrive about 10 minutes or so before your meeting, because you have to get through security. Make sure to, we're not bringing luggage, right? We're leaving luggage, any bags, anything that you have with you at the church. Want to keep it as light as possible to get into those buildings. I don't know what page this is, but near the very back of everyone's program, there is a map of the Capitol Hill area. Those locations in those lobby visits match this exactly. So if you are going to the Russell Senate building, find Russell on your map, look at your schedule. It'll tell you what time, what entrance to be at, and who to call if you need to call. My phone number is everywhere. My phone number is I'm going to get so many spam. Actually, this actually explains a lot. I'm having some realizations. But anyways, feel free to call. Text would be better if you have any issues at all. But before you leave today, I would really, really encourage you to take a look at your schedule. Make sure you're in the right state. I know some people go to college in a different state, or registration, technical things happen sometimes. You may have gotten put in a different state. Come talk to me. We can make that happen. But I really encourage you to look at your schedule. Below the schedule, there's a delegation list. And if you do not see your name, especially if you have those in-person meetings, come talk to me, because I need to give those lists to the staffers so that you can get in. If you are not on the list and you try and go in, it's more likely than not that you will not be able to go and attend that meeting. Tomorrow's going to be organized chaos. That has been my phrase for the last few days. And as you've probably heard many times, this is something we have not done before, but we're pulling it off. And that's partly because of your patience, your persistency, I don't know if persistency is a word, fill in another P, but the point is, come talk to me if you have, thank you. If you have questions, concerns, anything like that, I'm by the registration table the rest of the day. If you are a group that has a visit today, Monday, you should know, talk to your delegation leader, you should know where you are. If not, where are you going? There we go. It sounds like people need lunch, so I don't want to keep you any longer.
Wait.
We have one more thing that needs to be said.
Yeah.
And then, so thank you all for your patience. You know where to find me. I'm so excited to hear about your lobby visits. I'm going to turn it back over to Larissa.
Thank you, Justin. Very quickly, if you are a current or former Advocacy Corps organizer, can you come up to the stage? Because I want to take a picture with all of you. So former or current Advocacy Corps. Everyone else is free to go to lunch.